Welcome. Good evening to our first lecture this semester, the first of a series of 3 lectures under the title Natures. With the S, we would like to generate a debate on diversity of natures, be it historical, digital, real, or imagined. If we understand architecture as the discipline responsible for designing and planning our living environment, the habitat, we cannot avoid confronting ourselves with a new and contemporary understanding of nature, one that goes beyond our own discipline and is rather plural, diverse, and at the same time has an ecological, political, and technological agenda. We are very happy to start our fall program with Professor Maarten Delbeke, which gives us a lecture entitled Rebuilding the Landscape, the Primitive Hut as Natural Architecture. Maarten Delbeke holds the chair of the History and Theory of Architecture at the Department of Architecture at the ETH in Zurich since 2016. Introducing your biography is actually a lecture on its own. So I'm just taking some extracts. Maarten Delbeke studied architecture at the Faculty of Engineering and Architecture at Ghent University, where he obtained his PhD in 2001. He has published widely on his history and theory of Baroque architecture and art in Rome, France, and the southern Netherlands. On theoretical questions in the 18th and 19th century European architecture, and on the reception of early modern architecture in the 20th century. He also is active as an architectural critic, as the founding editor-in-chief of Architectural Histories, the online open-access journal of the European Architectural History Network, EAHN.
Yeah, it's a horrible name.
He seeks to explore digital methods in the research and dissemination of architectural history. Dear Maarten, it's a great pleasure and honor for us to have you here as our guest. And please join me to welcome Maarten Delbeke.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and also for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and also thank you very much for coming to this lecture at the start of the term in the evening. As you can see, I've changed the title of my lecture slightly, so it's now called The Column and the Square: The Primitive Hut as Natural Architecture. And what I want to do is look at 3 different ways to think about the origins of architecture. And what these 3 different ways of thinking about the origins of architecture have in common is that in some way or another they try to explain the existence of architecture or architectural artifacts in relation to nature or the landscape. Sometimes by explicitly grounding architecture in the landscape or in the territory, but also sometimes by suppressing the relationship between architecture and a territory or a specific site, and actually by this act of suppression actually making clear that this relationship is very important. So the talk is actually kind of a juxtaposition of these 3 ways of thinking about the origins of architecture in relation to the territory, which to some extent intersects on the figure of the tree or the standing rock. And this is, you could say, the thing that the 3 perspectives have in common. The other thing that they have in common is that, to some extent, they all involve a kind of mythology. Yeah? as I said to Heike, I'm just going to give these three, and I don't have a real conclusion. Somewhere I feel that they are related, and they are related in their structure, in some of the ideas and elements that they use. They are also chronologically related, so I'm going to talk about myths that are produced from the early 17th century to the mid-19th century. And at the same time, they're very different. So somewhere I hope that just by speaking about these three things in succession, that also for me it will become clear what their actual relationship is. Perhaps it won't become clear, but we will see that at the end, in an hour or so. I'll start with a first example, and it is the history of this statue, the statue which is called Our Lady of Goodwill, which is situated in Duffel. It's in Flanders, a very small town between Brussels and Mechelen. And so the history I'm referring to is this little book, which was published in 1717. The book describes how the statue that we see on the left was found in 1634 in a willow, so in a tree, by two boys who were herding cows. So they were herding their cows, and suddenly they saw this statue in the tree. People started coming to the statue, and the statue started to perform miracles. And as a consequence, the tree with the statue became a popular destination for pilgrims. Because more and more people were coming to the statue, it became necessary to to build a kind of container for the statue and for the tree. Not only to allow people sort of to express their devotion to the statue in better circumstances, but also to protect the tree, because people were taking little bits of the tree with them as a kind of token or a relic in order to protect them, because it was thought that the tree itself had miraculous properties. So there was first a primitive wooden chapel, but which was soon moved with the tree from the original site to be replaced by a stone chapel, which was this one. And in the stone chapel, there was this monumental altar, which was put right on the place where the tree originally stood. If you read this history, which was published by about the statue and the growing devotion and the chapels that were built, it's interesting that it basically casts the willow. So it talks about the willow, so the tree where the image or where the statue was found, as the model for the new chapel and the altar. And I quote from this booklet. So this is a citation. The booklet says, "It should be noted about trees that they seem to be made like churches. The trunk of the tree is the altar, and the branches that spread out above make the throne and the vault of the church." So in the history, the statue is linked to the chapel. The origin of the chapel provided its model, and as a result, the chapel entertains the same relationship to the statue as the tree. Okay, that was the first example. The second example, and this first example is really, you could say, an example of a very popular devotion for a miraculous statue that sort of generated this form of late Baroque architecture. In the second example, we look at a more, you could say, institutionalized example of the same process. On the 2nd July of 1609, which is the Feast of the Visitation, the Archdukes Albert and Isabella, who were at that time the governors of the southern Netherlands, the part of Europe that is now more or less Belgium, posed the first stone of the new church of Scherpenheuvel, near Diest, so excuse me, of this church. The area where the church was built had been very heavily disputed in the previous decades, and originally belonged to Willem the Silent, the Prince of Orange, you could say the leader of the Northern Netherlands, who led the Protestant rebellion against the Catholic Spanish Habsburgs in the Netherlands. So it's part of the Protestant-Catholic conflict, which obviously ran through this region as well. Now, the church was designed by Wenzel Koberger, an architect who had been brought literally from back to Italy by the archdukes to become their court architect. So the first stone of the church was laid in 1609, and then it was consecrated in 1627. Now, the church was the centerpiece of a completely designed new town. So this is the church, and this is a town that was established around it. And the official foundation of this town was you could say, a crucial step in a process of transformation. Yeah? Because Scherpenheuvel, which is literally translated sharp hill, had been the site of a kind of popular devotion quite similar to what happened in Duffel. So you would have a hill with a tree, and in the tree there was a miraculous image. And this, you could say, wild site, which was heavily disputed, which the Protestants and the Catholics fought about, transformed, thanks to the establishment of the town and the building of the church, into, you could say, one of the most important national sites of pilgrimage, and it is still today. So today you can still go there, for instance, to have your car blessed if you want to. Now, according to 17th century histories of the image, there had been an oak with a statue at least since 1500. It was stolen by the Protestants in the 1580s and then replaced in 1587. So originally, and this is all according to histories that were published in the 17th century, the image had been known to local worshippers from the nearby town of Zichem. But as soon as it was re-established in 1587, it started to generate much more spectacular miracles. Then because of that, it attracted the attention of Spanish soldiers who were in the region, as well as of the Jesuits, who basically proclaimed the fame of the statue across Europe. And in Scherpenheuvel, as in Duffel, people wanted to take little bits of the tree of the original oak with them for its healing properties. So in 1602, it was decided to cut down the tree and to put the image in a small wooden chapels. Interestingly, the trunk of the tree was used to make copies of the original image, of the original statue, and these copies became very valuable gifts. They become very important diplomatic gifts for the archdukes. The intervention of the archdukes is, you could say, then the moment when this site of pilgrimage became what could be termed a national symbol. When, because of the continuing war with the Northern Netherlands, Albert and Isabel made various pilgrimages to the primitive wooden chapel in order to ask for help in the military events. And when in 1604 a very important victory was obtained at the city of Ostend, it was declared, you could say, the archdukes took possession almost of the site and established this closed garden, a heptagonal closed garden. So you have to think this church away. So here was a very primitive wooden chapel, but they established this garden with in its center the chapel. And then after having established the garden, they built a church, and then they built this system of fortification. So this image basically shows, you could say, in one single image, this process of transformation. The image in the tree, which is then first housed in a chapel which still contains the tree, then a primitive stone chapel, which was an intermediate state, and then this far more complex building. Now, the church, as it was eventually built, is a very interesting building from an architectural historical point of view, because it has a centralized ground plan, but it combines a central space with what is called an ambulatory space, so you can actually circle around the central space without interrupting what is going on in the center. Here you have the main altar, which I showed some slides ago, where you could say a replica of the original tree is put on top of the image. But what is most peculiar about the church is that the plan is heptagonal, so it's a seven-pointed geometrical figure, which is completely unique, you could say, within the architecture of the period. The reason why this number 7 basically governs the whole plan of the church is because the number 7 has particular meanings in the devotion for the Virgin Mary. For instance, a devotion that was very important for the Habsburg dukes, and you could say for all the Habsburg dynasties across Europe, was the devotion to the Our Lady of the Seven Sorrows. And I mean, the lists of associations of the Virgin Mary with the number 7 are very extensive, but this is a very important one. And the second important one is the figure of the Domus Sapientia, the House of Wisdom, which in devotional literature of the 17th century is used as a metaphor for the Virgin Mary herself. The Virgin Mary is like the House of Wisdom, and the House of Wisdom is conventionally depicted as a dome on 7 columns. So what you see happening here is that you get a church which is, you could say, almost over-determined by the iconographical messages or the iconographical meanings that the archdukes want to invest the church with, and that they basically impose these kind of conditions on an architect who had been in Italy, who was, you could say, an expert in the language of Renaissance architecture, and that this architect basically had to find a way to accommodate this symbolism in his church. Now, why would the archdukes invest so much energy in erecting a church on a place like that? Because it's very peripheral. Still today, it's actually quite hard to get there by public transport, but it became this, you could say, literally national locus of invention, this national locus of pilgrimage. And basically what you see happening in Schekkenheuvel is you could say, the most articulate version of a process of negotiation, which took place all across the Habsburg Netherlands, and especially also in the zones of the Habsburg Empire, which were under pressure from Protestants. Namely, it was actually a kind of way of making a deal, you could say, to use a Trumpian metaphor. What did the deal actually consist of? So, on the one hand, by building the church, the Habsburg dukes legitimized a cult which was originally popular. And perhaps it's useful to point out that these popular cults, these devotions to these miraculous images found in trees, were often viewed with suspicion by the Catholic authorities because they clearly contain some pagan elements in them. The devotion was equally, you could say, addressed to the tree as it was to the statue. And also there was a huge proliferation of these cults. So you would have a miraculous virgin almost in every other village. So there was a kind of so these cults, you could say, were on the border of what was considered legitimately Catholic. So by basically adopting the cult, the Habsburgs rulers legitimized it. At the same time, and this is, I think, important to understand, they legitimized their own presence in the southern Netherlands by accepting and basically showing that they recognized these kinds of cults as something that literally belonged to the territory. You have to understand, of course, that that the archdukes were non-natives. They were not from the southern Netherlands. They came in, they married, they were put there as the governors of the southern Netherlands. So by adopting the cult, they legitimized the cult, but they also allowed themselves to be legitimized as people who recognized, you could say, the innate religiosity, or you could say the original religiosity that was present in the territory. That was, you could say, embedded in the territory. The reason why you could say, this process of double legitimation was so important has to do with the very particular circumstances in which Scherpenheuvel came into being. At that moment, in the first decades of the 17th century, the religious wars, or the war between Spain and the northern Netherlands, if you want to put it like that, was at its height. So the Netherlands were completely ravaged, were a complete mess. And this mess was, you could say, interpreted in religious terms. And if you look at the sources, it's clear that people saw this as a kind of punishment by God. So they were punished for the fact that they had abandoned God and that they had wavered in their faith. So this kind of, you could say, double deal between a local devotion and the rulers was actually a way of re-sanctifying the territory and to make amends, to basically make amends between the people of the southern Netherlands and God, God who was, in their view, busy punishing the whole region. And I show you a slide of this building. This is the so-called Broodhuis, which still stands on the Grand Place in Brussels, however, in a neo-Gothic restoration. And actually, the reason why it was restored in the 19th century is because Isabella, the Archduke Isabella, installed a big inscription which literally implored God to liberate the people of the southern Netherlands from war and famine. And so we have to understand, you could say, this process of adopting these very local, these cults that are literally anchored in the territory as a way to give extra weight to these to this claim or to this question. Now, all as I said, these cults of miracle-working statues of the Virgin in trees were literally a global phenomenon. And also in Switzerland, actually, you have quite a few examples of this phenomenon, which I haven't studied yet, but which I intend to do. And this is a frontispiece of a work that is called the Atlas Marianus, the Atlas of the Virgin, which shows the Virgin sitting on the house of Loreto, of which you have a copy here very close by in Hergiswald, and where basically from this single house you have the beams that basically show everywhere the Virgin has sort of manifested herself in the earth, on earth. And exactly, you could say the emergence of all these miraculous cults generated an enormous amount of literature, which for each of these cases, for each of these statues, tried to explain where it came from, why it was there, how it came, how the cult of the statue came to be, and then how this cult progressively transformed into a sanctioned cult. And actually, the most important of these books is a book that I want to delve into a little bit deeper. It's called Brabantio Mariana. Brabantia is Brabant, the central province of the southern Netherlands, devoted to Mary. And interestingly enough, Wigmans develops, you could say, a very learned argument to explain why there are so many miracle-working statues of the Virgin in the region. And he says, actually, if you look at ancient sources, if you look at Roman sources, but also some sources of the Church Fathers, we learn that there was a very important indigenous cult of trees. When we look at our pagan forefathers, the Celts, they had a tendency to worship trees. And it is actually this tendency, which is, you could say, kind of original primitive religiosity, which was articulated by the worship of these elements in the territory. It was this primitive religiosity which was transformed by Christianity into a legitimate cult, the cult of the Virgin Mary, and which you could say instigated a transfer of the devotional feelings from the tree to the statues that were held by it. Now, why would Wigmans make such a kind of elaborate argument to explain why people are so devoted to statues of the Virgin Mary in Belgium? Probably there are two important reasons, and these two important reasons have to do with his thinking about the relationship between origins and territory. One thing that Wigmans does is actually to naturalize this devotion. He says there is a kind of intrinsic tendency amongst these people, amongst the people of Belgium, to worship these artifacts. In that sense, he tries to extract this devotion from the realm of a kind of constructed religiosity and basically attaches it to the nature of the territory itself. Secondly, by doing that, he sort of erases history to some extent. Again, between the 1560s and the 1620s, 1630s, the Netherlands were in continuous war. This war was mainly spurred by the religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics. And actually, you could say the Protestant uprisings in the 1550s, 1560s were extremely violent in certain regions of the southern Netherlands, which you could say is almost epitomized in what we call in Dutch the Beeldenstorm, the destruction of religious images, which took place in the 1560s and 1570s. Obviously, the whole Protestant uprisings were a local phenomenon. It was not that Protestants were dropped from the northern Netherlands and went to war with Catholics. No, it was actually the local population who sort of shifted its allegiance, and then basically after 1585 was basically forced back into Catholicism. So there was, you could say, and this is a term that is being increasingly used by historians of the period, a kind of national trauma. I mean, many people have been involved in different kinds of Protestant actions. Many people have been forced to convert back to Catholicism. There had been quite important destructions especially in certain urban centers, and obviously also the Spanish troops had ravaged the country in their turn. So there was a deep trauma that basically lay on the territory. What Wigmans does by sort of explaining the devotion of the Virgin Mary as something that is, you could say, proper to the region and that is registered from the most ancient times is basically erasing this part of history or jumping over this traumatic history and basically anchoring the present not in what happened 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, but into some kind of mythical past. The third thing that Wigmans does by explaining this kind of evolution of this kind of incredibly primitive devotion for trees as the distant origin of devotion, the devotion for the Virgin Mary in the present, is creating a kind of link between, you could say, the very sophisticated and rich and absolutely non-primitive shrines, chapels, churches, and chapels for the Virgin Mary as things that are intrinsically rooted to their primitive origin. And again, images like this do exactly that. They say, okay, you have this incredibly expensive, splendid church, but actually this church is, to some extent, a kind of version of this tree with the image. So what Wigmans does is actually a very smart way of legitimizing the enormous amount of ornaments, the enormously rich architecture that is being devoted literally to the Virgin Mary, not only by saying, okay, actually this is rooted in that, but this is also proof of the fact that we have left this primitive stage behind, and so that we are no longer in this kind of very vague, in this very vague and ambiguous moment that we can associate with these distant origins where people venerated trees and rocks and perhaps statues. We've outgrown that, but we've outgrown that in a way that is still anchored in this past. I'll skip some slides to move a little bit forward. One of the interesting things that when you look at the architecture of many chapels that were built, reconstructed at the end of the 16th century, early 17th century, and then were sort of developed over the course of the 17th and the 18th century, is that, and so we, a couple of years ago, we've done a research project about that in Belgium, that if you look at the architectural evolution of many of these chapels, is that you almost see kind of architectural translation of the process that Wigmans describes in theory. In many cases, we see that actually originally there was a very primitive or a very simple architectural element that was constructed to house a statue and sometimes the statue in the tree. And what you then see happening very often is a process that we call organic growth. So where we see that the original position of the statue, which has disappeared here but which was here, remains more or less the same. Now here it shifts into the apse at a given moment, but also that the original container built around the statue is maintained almost as a kind of relic of the primitive devotion, which has the result that you can actually see or read this kind of process of deprimitivization of the architecture that is built around the tree in the fabric of the building. And this is another example in Zemst, close to Brussels, where you had a very primitive chapel in the end of the 16th century, which was completely maintained, but was expanded with actually quite sophisticated church, and where the statue was then moved forward into the apse of the new church. So this is, you could say, my first body of myths about the origin of architecture in relation to the territory that I wanted to discuss, where basically, you could say this growth of architecture, this development of architecture, of an architectural frame, is explained in terms of a religious cult and the customs that are accrued around it, that very often, or actually always, involve some kind of divine intervention, an intervention that explains why a statue suddenly appears in a tree, why it is found, and especially, of course, why it starts performing miracles. It's also a kind of stories or a kind of myth that describe a kind of covenant, a kind of deal, a kind of agreement between, you could say, the human sphere and the divine sphere, which is mediated through this, which is mediated in this object, originally the primitive object of the tree and the statue, and then progressively the ever more sophisticated object of the altar and the church. And the final point that is important here, I think, is that exactly this process is articulated by means of artifacts. So obviously they are partly articulated through stories. Much of the material that I've presented here is derived from printed stories of the 17th century, but at the same time you can map these stories on artifacts. You can sort of say, okay, in the artifacts, in, you could say, the fabric of these buildings, we see something of this process of negotiation between the divine and the human that took place in this part of the territory. Now, the second story about the origins of architecture in relation to the territory that I want to discuss, and I'll try to do this very briefly, is, you could say, the most well-known one, or the one that we are sort of most familiar with, especially as students of architecture. That's the origin of, you could say, excuse me, Vitruvius' account of the origins of architecture. As you may know, Vitruvius describes how, you could say, architecture emerged in society at the beginning of Book 2 of his 10 books of architecture. Book 2, which is devoted to the different materials of architecture. And you could say the purpose of Vitruvius' origin story is to explain how different ways of building are related to the different kinds of materials that one finds in different regions of the world. And the way he explains this process is by conjoining a myth and a history. So his myth is, I think, quite well known. He says there's primitive man. Primitive man is scattered all around the world. Then there's a storm. Lightning strikes a tree. There's fire. People gather around the fire. They start making words. Then they want to settle. In order to settle, they want to cover themselves. They look at how animals do that. They imitate the animals, and then progressively their buildings become more and more sophisticated. And then architecture is born, according to Vitruvius, when humanity starts using the proportions of the human body in these constructions, when what he calls symmetria is born. So this is the myth. Very interestingly, Vitruvius intersects this myth with a history. He says, you know, this myth, or he doesn't call it a myth, what I say about the origins of building and architecture is true, because you can still see it happening. It is still going on. If you go, and then he goes, he points to the periphery of the Roman Empire, or what is then the periphery of the Roman Empire. If you go to the Gaul, or you go to Lusitania, to Spain, or wherever, you see that people still build the way that according to the way that I just described at the very beginning of society. So, like Wigmans, Vitruvius describes a kind of historical process where literally architecture basically grows out of the soil, but this process takes place at different speeds in different places. And obviously, the place where this process has gone the farthest is in the center of the world, and the center of the world is obviously Rome, huh? In his view. I'm not making an absolute statement. Now, so this idea that there is a close relationship between the emergence of architecture, or that you could say the conditions of the emergence of architecture are determined by the site, by the natural conditions of its emergence, is something that is, you could say, picked up quite eagerly in the 15th and the 16th century. And I just show you images from the treatise on architecture by Filarete, which was written in the 1470s, 1480s, where it's a manuscript that circulated in different versions, which was only published actually in the 20th century, but which was quite well known, where Filarete describes how architecture originated when man was chased from paradise, and that being chased from paradise, he needed to cover himself. The first architecture, according to Filarete, is just someone covering his head. Adam, not someone, Adam covering his head with his hands. But then he takes trees, branches, and so on, and builds these primitive constructions. And this is from Cesare Cesariano's translation of architecture, of Vitruvius of 1521, where you see also in this kind of synthetic image a similar process. So out of necessity, humanity looks for materials to build, and with what they find, they establish these kind of primitive constructions, and these primitive constructions are form the basis of architecture. Now, what is, I think, quite striking is that there is, in the 17th century, and obviously people return to Vitruvius time and again, until now, basically. And this origin myth, this idea of how architecture originated, is something that attracts an enormous amount of attention. First, you could say, in the late 15th, early 16th century, and then again starting from the late 17th century and well into the 18th century. Now, what you see happening in the late 17th, early 18th century, which is exactly the period that I was talking about when I talked about these miracle-working statues of the Virgin, you see an interesting process. Again, the origin myth becomes an incredibly important tool to explain why architecture looks the way it does. So this is called the etiological argument. So the etiology is used to explain, you could say, the rules of architecture in the present by relating these rules to a moment of origin. Yeah? And the origin of architecture is, you could say, sought in nature. Yeah? From the late 17th century, you have this increasing tendency to argue or to find the ultimate reason for why architecture looks the way it does in nature, and more particular in the resemblance between columns and trees. Paradoxically, you could say, this progressive identification of architecture with nature leads to a kind of delocalization of the origin myths of architecture. What do I mean with that? And this is a process that takes place in the writings of Claude Perrault. So Claude Perrault, who was a scientist very close to the court of Louis XIV, who made a translation of Vitruvius, which he published in 1673, wrote also a kind of shortened version of the treatise of Vitruvius. And he gives a kind of condensed version of the origin myth. And in Perrault's condensed version of the origin myth, there is no mention whatsoever of the localization of this origin myth. The origin myth becomes a kind of mechanism of imitation. So what does Perrault say? Okay, in order to have the ideas of columns, people looked at trees. Trees have a certain shape, and they are larger at the bottom than at the top. So this is what was imitated for the columns. And then nature provided inspiration for ornaments, and these ornaments were then, you could say, transformed into stone. So on the one hand, nature becomes this kind of absolute model for architectural invention, but at the same time, nature becomes literally delocalized. It becomes a kind of abstract principle. And you could say that this process finds its apogee, or you could say its most explicit articulation in this figure, the primitive hut, as it was, you could say, proposed by Laugier, and I'm sure you've heard of it. And Laugier is very explicit about it. He said, if nature herself had made architecture, it would look like this. 4 trunks that were put upright, 4 branches that were horizontal, and then a roof. And this primitive natural architecture is, you could say, the type or the prototype for every valid architecture that has come afterwards. And this, very interestingly, this is what Laugier calls his theory of architecture. He says it is in nature that we can find theoretical principles that generate particular forms, and these principles are basically at the foundation of architecture. So architecture, in essence, are 4 branches in a square, which are posts, which support 4 horizontal branches as beams, which are covered with a wooden roof. So you get a complete collapsing of architecture into nature. But at the same time, you could say this primitive hut of Laugier doesn't have a site. It's not site-specific, to put it in 20th or early 21st century words. It could be anything, because it embodies a universal principle. But this universal principle can only be, you could say, articulated or visualized by having recourse to nature, which I think is an interesting paradox. So what you see happening here, so you could say this second set of origin stories is an idea of a hut which is natural, but which also acts as the embodiment of an idea, a universal which needs to be modified. And what you get is a kind of progressive disjunction of the hut from the site, its territory, and you could say the place where the tree originates. And in that sense, again, I just juxtapose them here, but here you could say the tree becomes this kind of almost black hole where that sucks in all architecture and which becomes the essence of architecture, whereas in the case of the Miracleworking statues of the Virgin, you have the opposite process where the tree, as a primitive model, you could say, continues to exist in its ever more sophisticated articulations. But in both instances, there is a process of imitation and a process of modeling going on. I now turn to my third story, which you could say third, you could say origin myth of architecture, which again you could say brings in a particular perspective on the relationship between architecture and territory, not necessarily by means of trees, but especially by means of standing rocks. I'll paraphrase it quite briefly. It's an idea, and again, it's not the first and the only time that the idea is articulated, but it's the most systematic articulation of the myth that I want to discuss. it's presented by Jean-Louis VLSSM. We don't know very much about this person. He was probably an architect. He was definitely a Freemason, who lived in the second half of the 18th century, and who wrote 6 letters on architecture. And again, I'll move forward a little bit. And actually, one of the motivations of, or one of the reasons why he wants to write these letters is because he fundamentally disagrees with Loger. Loger says, again, the origin of the column is the tree, and the tree is the origin of the column because it's this, you could say, this basic tectonic element, this basic structural element of architecture. Loger says this is basically completely untrue. The origin of the column is not, you could say, an element of construction, but is the vertical element, be it a tree or a stone, that is a monument. VLSSM is deeply steeped in Freemasonic ideas about the origin of civilization, which basically say that in distant times, at the origins of civilization, civilization was basically agricultural. There was a kind of global agricultural civilization. And it is within this primitive society that architectural elements emerge, not out of necessity, but because these agricultural civilizations need recordings of their most important knowledge. They also need to have sundials, they have to have elements that indicate the positions of the planets and so on. So in these primitive societies, people put vertical rocks. And these rocks, you could say, are markers of the position of the planets, are markers of certain stages of the year. And progressively, they also become markers of the law, because people start inscribing laws, ideas, or important notions on these vertical elements. And this, according to VLSSM, this is the true origin of architecture, not a kind of hut made of wood, but these monuments that were constructed by these primitive agricultural people as a kind of books of the law and books of religion. And VLSSM is very explicit about it. He said, architecture originated as the book of humanity. Or in the way we would call it, as the monuments of humanity. And he basically identifies, you could say, 2 you could say primitive types of architecture. One is the dolmen, an element that he says was a kind of universal, an element that we find across the whole world, and there he relies on accounts of travelers and, you could say, proto-anthropological literature, or it's the kind of vertical supports that we find in underground spaces. These are, you could say, the primitive types of architecture. So I'm not going to go through these texts. But I think it's important to point to some of VLSSM's sources. So he relies very much on, you could say, the burgeoning literature on voyages to the east, and especially to China and India. But he also relies on the kind of antiquarian studies that are being produced, again, at a pretty high rate from the late 17th century onwards throughout the 18th century, where learned Benedictines make these kinds of inventories of the different kinds of statues, elements, and so on that are found across Europe. A very important source for VLSSM is the Recueil d'Antiquités égyptienne, grecque, romaine, et gauloise by the Comte Caylus, which is actually the first attempt to make a kind of systematic arrangement, but also a systematic comparison of ancient elements, or what we would call archaeological objects, from these 4 different civilizations across history. And it's these kinds of images that VLSSM would have seen in de Caylus' work, and which would have induced him to think of these elements as a kind of primitive architecture, these kinds of road signs and so on. Okay, so I've been talking for an hour now, so that's... And so this is where you could say the story ends, to some extent. What we see happening with VLSSM is, I think, a very interesting form of, again, using history to establish a myth about the origins of architecture. A history that is, you could say, very much informed about the very close relationship between artifacts and their original site. At the same time, VLSSM is obviously very interested in establishing universal principles that articulate themselves in different ways across, in his view, the whole world. So he identifies, as you could say, primitive types of objects, which, again, according to him, you can find as easily in Southern America as you can find them in Japan or India, and obviously as well in Europe. And these objects basically point to a kind of shared primitive past from which architecture originates. Now, if we, you could say, compare this or bring this into relationship with the first types of origin stories that I discussed, is that you could say that in VLSSM there's a new type of an amnesia at work. He looks for origins beyond Christianity, and he's very explicit about this. Obviously, he's a Freemason. He's not interested in Christianity at all. But he tries to identify very similar mechanisms as the ones that are described by Wigmans in pre-Christian civilizations. At the same time, very interesting, when it comes to written sources, he uses very often the same ancient sources as Wigmans, who wrote this history of the cult of Mary in Belgium as well. Interesting, Viel is also very explicit in his criticism of Vitruvius, of the second type of origin story that we discussed, because Viel said that Vitruvius is basically a fake. It's a kind of fake history that has been written in Roman times and then has been reproduced since the Renaissance, and which has basically obscured this far more deeper truth that he discovers across the world. So there is, you could say, a kind of implicit dialogue between the three types of stories that I've told, but it's, you could say, a dialogue that acts by means of suppression or by correction. So it is by negating the other stories that the new stories come into being, but at the same time, this process of suppression is intended or aimed at finding or at discovering very similar mechanisms of imitation and evolution. So this gives us, I think, and this is what I would propose as some kind of conclusion, or at least an end. I think we have sort of seen three models to think about the relationship between architecture and territory and landscape in these three different kinds of myths. One is, you could say this idea of organic growth, that architecture to some extent grows out of the territory. The third one, the second one, is to think of the relationship between architecture and its site in terms of tectonics and its ornament. Basically, that architecture, you could say, avails itself or uses what it finds in order to be built. And the third model is, you could say, the model of the monument. Architecture is the thing that gives meaning to a particular site. What I find very interesting in these different kinds of stories is, and that's why I changed the title, is, you could say, the dialectic or the tension between the point and the square. Yeah? To some extent, the first and the third type of stories are about points in the landscape, about trees that mark a specific point, whereas the second type of story is about squares. But obviously these squares also exist as a kind of conjunction between four points. Huh? Probably this difference between point and square points or hints at different ways in which architecture occupies a place in a landscape or marks a certain moment in a landscape. It is a different way in which you could say our architecture sort of articulates the way it originates in a particular site. A final point that I want to put on the table, and I just use this final image as a way of putting it forward. What I'm obviously also very struck by is, you could say, the synchronicity of these three types of stories. So again, the kind of stories that I've laid out have sort of developed and been discussed and debated by people living in the same geographical region in the same period. So it's safe to assume that these stories existed next to each other, but that they basically chose to some extent, or were intended to operate in different realms: the realm of architecture, the realm of religion, and you could say the realm of archaeology, anthropology. But still, the fact that these different stories operate in different realms is, in my view, not an entirely satisfactory explanation for the fact that they basically tried sort of to turn their backs to each other. And as kind of counterexample, and that's my very last word, I want to sort of throw in the mix a kind of architecture that I'm increasingly fascinated with, and where I actually think that perhaps exists at the intersection point of these different myths, these three different kinds of myths, and which is the architecture I'm talking about is the Rococo architecture that you actually find in this region, because obviously it is an architecture that is rooted in the classical tradition, that is a tradition that is, you could say, associated with the figure of the primitive hut. At the same time, it is an architecture that is deeply imbued with, or that is generated by the kind of religious and political phenomena that are, you could say, intrinsically bound up with the first set of stories. But and then finally, it is obviously an architecture that, in its relationship to the landscape especially, is inherently monumental, which marks a place as a place of religion. So perhaps there's something to delve into a little bit further, but I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. You brought us back to the origins of architecture in different stories. And there might be some questions from the public, especially from the students. Please.
Yeah, I have a question about the first of the three examples. So you talk about this evolution between the primitive and into the non-primitive. That was interesting for to make at that point. And I was wondering if the kind of architectural language that that church got has also something to do with this legitimization, because it feels, or it looks to me like something like a local problem has been solved, has been somehow tackled through the use of a rather global or imported architectural language. And I wonder if there is an intention also in that choice. I mean, you mentioned how the architect, perhaps he was forced to have this symbolic ground floor and special configuration, but somehow the language itself is not really showing this symbolism.
I mean, there are cases where there's a very intentional play with this kind of double-sidedness of the casting of local phenomenon in a global, or it's almost systematically cast in a Roman language. Again, as a way, you could say, to make this kind of double deal. Yeah? Because by showing the ability to cast this kind of local phenomenon in a Roman idiom, it's sort of sanctioned. Yeah? It's established as something that is part of, that is legitimized as part of the Roman cult. Yeah? And at the same time, it is a way of showing that this Roman architectural idiom is able to, you could say, accommodate or adapt itself to these local circumstances. Actually, in the case of Duffel, my first example, it's very striking because the side altars in that church are almost copies of Bernini's altars from 10 years earlier. So there is this very, very explicit attempt to be to enter into a dialogue artistically with the center, yeah? But within something within this localized context. And for instance, in the case of Scherpenheuvel, this is the first domed church in the southern Netherlands. So also the choice to make a dome is clearly a statement of intent of saying, okay, we take this idiom from Italy and specifically from Rome, and we literally root it here in this particular context. So it's a very good point.
How would you translate all those phenomena that we were just talking about, you know, from the imported typologies, incorporated symbolism, and playing a crucial role in politics in our time? They're very human processes, somewhere between the rationalist faith in whatever power. Yeah. It's still happening, but in a different way.
No, definitely. And I think, to some extent, what I find really fascinating with these 17th century authors is that they had almost some of these anthropological intuitions. So when this Norbertine in the 17th century says, you know, the fact that people fall on their knees in front of the statue, it's basically because it's always been like that. And interestingly, when 19th century authors start writing histories of the Belgian customs, you have this typical 19th century literature. They again revert to the same kind of arguments, which is partly a way of sort of placing themselves in tradition and also articulating their political viewpoints, whether they're clerical or anti-clerical. But which is clearly also kind of recognition of some kind of an anthropological phenomena. I mean, for the present, I find this. The thing is, of course, and I think it relates back to the first question. And now I speak as a historian. So, what happens in the 17th, 18th century, I think, can only be understood historically. If we take into account this very important this relationship between center and periphery, Rome and the rest of the world, urbi et orbi, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the fact that humanity felt a kind of urgent need to negotiate its relationship with the divine, because otherwise eternal hell was. And this is obviously something that is, again, perhaps on an anthropological level, still there. I think we still think that we need to negotiate with whatever thing that is outside of us, but it's completely fragmented and we have a hard time naming it, or we recenter it completely on ourselves. But at the same time, it's also a fundamental difference. I mean, if you live with the fear of hell and the fear of death, then I think your universe is structured in a different way than when you don't. So in that sense, I think that many mechanisms, also in our relationship to material objects, are still there. But obviously that the structures that guide this relationship, I mean, have really fractured in a quite dramatic way. No? That's a very general point, of course.
And very Eurocentric.
Probably, yeah. In what sense?
I have the feeling that when you look at the history of the past 50 years,
yes,
there are big parts of the world turning, towards religion.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah. I, as a non-believer European, I look at it also more without really understanding it. But it's a fact that, and I was wondering if those, typologies of, I would say, mosques or whatever,
sure.
It's the same thing is happening. Sure, not with trees and figures,
sure.
but with typologies.
But I mean, tree worship is global. That's a global phenomenon. There have been some very good exhibitions about this, and so tree worship is something that you find. It's literally a global phenomenon, and it's also transhistorical. Yeah? So many of these mechanisms, again, also this whole idea of kind of the sacred place, the sacrality of the place, and that the sacrality of the place can be sort of defined or described by means of a certain geometry or certain materialities. I mean, these are things that are I think to some extent universal. I haven't studied it myself in a global perspective because from my perspective, my interest is understanding again how architectural interventions or artifacts are being legitimized and you could say accultured in a specific historical context. That's my question. Yeah? But again, when I looked into tree worship, it's clear that, I've been through this literature, that this is a kind of universal. But to come back to the point that I made a Eurocentric remark, of course, and to some extent I also, I like to vindicate my Eurocentrism because so I work on these things. I've been working on them for a long time. I'm Belgian with a Catholic background, and it's taken me a long time to sort of even get a kind of basic understanding of this. So I'm not going to claim. No. But I also want to make it clear because it can be a critique, and so I prefer to talk about things that I know something of. But at the same time, and now I'm not talking as a historian, but as someone who's living today, it's very interesting to see how we in Europe are completely unable to deal in a kind of meaningful way with religiosity, and which I think means that we haven't digested, we are not secularized, I think, or we're only sort of secularized to a certain extent, and sort of we're being confronted with this emergent religiosity, and sort of we're basically thrown back in questions that we haven't solved for ourselves, but that's my opinion.